Welcome, everybody. I'm really glad that everybody was able to come to our roundtable for the annual dinner for the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. What we were thinking, and this is going to unfold as it unfolds, we just were basically thinking if you pull in some of the smartest people you know in a room and you talk about economic, fiscal, and given the world that we're in right now, political issues, it will lead to a really worthwhile discussion, particularly if it's led by an excellent moderator. So I am going to set the stage for 1 second, turn it over to our co-chairs just to welcome everybody, and then turn it over to Chuck Lane, who is truly one of the most interesting and thoughtful thinkers who works the Washington Post editorial board and informs my thoughts very, very regularly. I'm glad to be this discussion. But what we were thinking, we have a couple speakers who are going to kind of kick this off with some thoughts, ideas, and then just go into full chaotic roundtable. If it's possible, I'd like to start with a discussion of where we are in the economy and what the threats are and what we think sort of short, medium, long-term threats may be. Move a little bit into thinking about our favorite issue, the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, the fiscal issues, and what kinds of threats that might cause. I know that a fiscal crisis in the U.S. is not what a fiscal crisis somewhere else might be, but I'm also worried that we're in a moment where a lot of people are acting like there's no risk on national debt at all. So we thought we might explore a little bit about what those fiscal threats would look like. And then really interesting topic, just because of the divisions in the country and the world right now, is thinking about how these economic tensions are contributing to the political tensions and how they may play out differently. It's bad enough if you have an economic downturn or threat of some sort, but when you layer that against the political divides we have and our inability to respond, it may be really, really trying for us. So that's my thought of how we might go on these topics, and again, I think we'll just go wherever the discussion goes. I want to quickly turn over to our two terrific co-chairs, Tim Penny and Leon Panetta, just to welcome people, and then we will let Chuck Lane kick things off. We can also do a round welcome introductions for 1 second if you want to, or just look at the bio. So, Tim.
Well, I will start by doing what you asked us to do, and that's welcoming everyone. It's always edifying to have these conversations. This is really a tradition of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. I recall in my very first year in Congress, 1983, that a roundtable discussion like this was orchestrated by your predecessor, Cheryl Cox Wade. And I went to that thinking, boy, I'm really in high clover here. And I looked around the room and CEO directors and PA directors and others. And here I am 30 years later and I feel the same way that I'm in high clover to be with this group. The work of this committee has been tremendously important through the years, but success has ebbed and flowed. We had a period of time during Leon's leadership of the Budget Committee and the Office of the Budget where these issues were taken seriously and significant progress was made, but we've had other times where this issue has slipped off the agenda. The Committee for Responsible Budget has been there throughout. And when the leaders are ready, we are ready. And I applaud Maya and her crew for the continuing work in the vineyard to make sure that the policy options, policy analysis is there, so that when the time is right, we can contribute to the solution. The only thing I'll mention that's more of a speech than welcome is the one big issue that I think is a threat to economic prosperity is
I'll sit down anyway. Even on the floor.
That weighs heavily, markets that weighs heavily on corporate decisions, and at some point it's going to weigh heavily on consumers. So that would be one nugget that I would draw up that maybe have others speak to that issue. Leon.
Well, I want to join Tim and Maya in inviting all of you here, but welcoming all of you to this roundtable to have what I think is a very critical discussion about kind of the state of the economy and how it relates to the other challenges that we're confronting. I was giving a speech downtown and I walked out and somebody said, you know that John Bolton has just gotten fired. And what bothered me is that I said, so what? You know, that in many ways, I think we've become almost immune to this daily roller coaster that goes on. I was just talking to a group of interns that we train at the Panetta Institute, congressional interns, and they come back to work with the delegation, both Republicans and Democrats. And I looked out at them, and they're all just, beginning to work in these congressional offices. And I said that in many ways, it may be your generation that will have to ultimately respond and try to put us back on track. Because I'm beginning to believe that the changes that are necessary for our country and for national security are not going to come from the top down. The only way we're going to change is probably from the bottom up. And I think that's why it's important for people like all of you to gather around the table to discuss these issues, because in the end, the only way our democracy survives is when people care enough about what's happening to begin to make a difference. And so I'm hoping that as a result of the discussion we have today, that this isn't just another volume on a shelf, but more importantly, it's an inspiration to try to get some changes made that can put us back on the right track.
Well, thank you very much, and I'd like to thank Maya for the kind words. And I guess I'm sort of the air traffic controller of the discussion that's about to occur. And Maya, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe our flight pattern is going to be something like this: that 4 speakers who I will identify in turn are going to give brief presentations, and then that will be your grist for raising questions or comments, succeeding discussion. And I guess when you want to make your intervention, just put your card up like that. When she told me, tell them to flip their cards, I did mine like that. It just shows you why I'm so highly qualified to be moderator. But you guys know how to flip your cards, and just do that. And I will, with your indulgence and your patience, because I know we have a lot of people with a lot of good things to say, I will try to be as fair and balanced and unafraid as I can be in going through the discussion. So the first person on our list is Fred Post, Peterson Institute, who is going to give us a few words, about 5 minutes, on the trade war and how it can develop with China and what might dig into the current crisis.
Okay, Maya, thanks for inviting me. It was a classic bait and switch. You said come talk to a roundtable on fiscal policy, and then you said, oh, by the way, talk about the trade war.
Yeah, I did that to all of you, so each one of you.
Well, it played to my comparative advantage, so
It's also a rectangular table.
in any event, trade war. Let me make 4 quick lead-off points. The first is we obviously are in a trade war with China, but a little more broadly. I'll come back to that briefly. There are real trade problems with China. China's trade and investment policies do distort the world. They do create an unlevel playing field. They do cheat on the international rules. But the way the administration has gone about it is both ineffective, I think, in achieving an effective outcome to that, and hugely disruptive for other reasons. Fair enough to hit China for its violations of the rules. Fair enough, actually, for China to retaliate, both illegal, incidentally, under the international rules. You have to get approval first. But that's fair enough. But then Trump retaliated against their retaliation, which makes it a trade war. And then they came back and sit for that ever since. And so now we're in a situation where import restrictions against China are now covering about $500 billion, if fully implemented on December 15th. But we still don't know if they will be. But if they are, that will cover about $500 billion worth of U.S. trade. Trump has threatened import barriers on another $500 billion or so, autos, Mexico over immigration, withdrawal from NAFTA. So if he did all of his threats, on top of steel and aluminum already out there, you'd have somewhere between $1 trillion and $1.2 trillion worth of import coverage, with average tariffs of somewhere between 10 and 25%, depending on the product, but it averages about 20. So you've got roughly consumer tax on Americans through the tariff mechanism of about $100 billion as of now, and it could go to double or more than that if the full panoply of import protection is put on the board. Now, $100 billion, that's half of 1% of GDP. You can think of that as kind of a tax increase that depresses the economy by that amount. But of course, that's only half the story, because the foreigners retaliate. So when the foreigners hit your exports to an almost, not quite dollar for dollar, but almost equal amount, it kind of doubles the ante. So in those sort of rough, broad, macro terms, you're covering about, you're having about a 1 percentage point hit on the economy. Keep in mind, this is the classic lose-lose policy proposition. Because on the one hand, the tariffs, of course, increase prices. Not normally thought of as a good thing. Yeah, they disagree at this point. But not normally thought as a good thing. So you increase prices, and of course, you depress economic activity. So it's really classic lose-lose. You've saved a few jobs in steel and elsewhere at a price anywhere between $600,000 to $1 million per, not very good cost-benefit analysis. All this, obviously, if you go to my basic question, weakens the economy further. So far, not huge, probably a few tenths of a percentage point, but if it played through fully, it could be quite significant. In addition, is the point Tim Penny made, that all this backing and forthing in particular makes a huge, huge addition to uncertainty in the economy, depressing investment in general, investment in trades in particular, and therefore raising further doubts about the economic prospect. You can't quantify that, you can't put it in a model, but that is a very serious and additional element that makes the economics of the proposition very risky, and indeed probably the biggest single uncertainty out there facing the economy at the moment. So that's point one. Point two, the trade war is much more than a trade war. Now that's partly because the bulk of this is with China, which represents more than a trade or economic threat to the United States. This is, of course, now increasingly a security issue. The trade and particularly investment issues morph into being security-related, the Huawei, CTE kind of issues in particular demonstrate that. China is, in fact, the rising competitor to the United States, not just in Asia, but across the board worldwide. I happen to be finishing a book on the competition between China and the United States for global economic leadership, which is just a piece of the even broader puzzle. You're all familiar with the Thucydides trap, rising power against the incumbent power. Well, folks, this is it. And this is the first time in the more than 1 century of American world domination, particularly in the world economy, that we've had a competitor. There are 4 reasons, I won't go into them, why the United States has been the dominant economy for over a century. But one of them is very simple. There's been no competition. There's been no economy, no entity anywhere like us in terms of size, financial markets, currency, et cetera, et cetera. China's still got some big weaknesses, it's certainly not there yet. But when you do the kind of projections I'm doing in my book, you come to the conclusion that China's going to be roughly equivalent to the U.S. in global economic power terms on almost any variable you can imagine within the next couple of decades, if it's not already there, as it is on a few. Even if you add in the U.S. alliances, the hegemonic coalition, as political science calls, which have buttressed U.S. support and leadership for this last half century at least, China gets pretty close to equivalent status. So in terms of how to think about it, it's not that China's going to dominate the world. The U.S. is going to disappear. We're not fading. We're not declining, I think, in any subjective sense. We may lose our will for leadership. That's certainly an abdication that we're seeing as disrupt now. But in terms of capability, I think ours is not in any kind of generalized decline. But China's going to be catching us, roughly reaching rough equivalent. They're not going to dominate. We're not going to go back to dominance. We're going to have to learn from how to live with rough equivalence. And that seems to be the policy challenge. Just 2 final quick points. I'm going to wait. One is Trump trade war is not just with China. He's, of course, stupidly declared war on his allies as well as his adversaries. So you've got the steel and aluminum conflict with Europe and Japan and recently with NAFTA countries. You've got a whole series of trade conflicts. It's declared war on the World Trade Organization itself. So it's a much broader conflict which has undermined the effort against China and also reduced the chance for successful outcome. Finally, the big long-term implication of all this is really a threat to the used term, liberal international economic order that has set the global economic environment for the last 75 years. There is, what's going on is an existential threat to the continuation of the open economic system. A lot of it can be recouped if Trump's not reelected, but as many of you know, it's not as if the Democrats have been heroes on all these issues. So the question of whether the U.S. is going to go back into future leadership, any kind of global economic responsibility, whether the global economic system can survive the loss of its key leader of the last 75 years, all those are big questions, adding further to the uncertainty and bringing a huge political dimension into this discussion.
Thank you, Brett. Sitting next to me is Ricky Penner, also among this group, doesn't need any introduction. I'll give a brief one anyway, former director CEO, and he is going to talk about how this trade war, changing demographics, and the national debt, financial crisis, God forbid,
Well, fiscal crises are a serious thing. First of all, it can't be forecast. It's very steady ratio, deficit sizes. They're often set off by some event clearly that's completely unrelated to fiscal policy, but clearly exposes the country's fiscal vulnerability. For example, Ireland's crisis after the turn of the century was set off by a collapse of the housing bubble. Sweden's in the early 1990s was provoked by a banking crisis. Whether a trade war, demographics, or current law projections of a rapidly rising debt could set off a U.S. crisis does not seem likely at the moment, but crises often catch us by surprise, and by definition, surprises are not predictable. But there's certainly no denying that we're vulnerable fiscally. We're now on an unsustainable fiscal path, with almost every projection showing debt rising faster than the economy for as far as the eye can see. At the same time, neither political party shows much interest in getting off that path. Democratic candidates promise much free stuff that they claim to pay for, but they do nothing about the large deficits that they're going to inherit. But we will get off this unsustainable path eventually, because the debt can't go to infinity. We'll either get off it because we thoughtfully adopt a package of budget reforms, or because financial markets force our hand. Ironically, while interest in the problem has diminished, it has become more severe. Baby boomers are turning 65 in huge numbers. They're pouring into Social Security and Medicare. The Congress responded to the problem by passing a very large tax cut and easing caps on discretionary spending. They seem to be almost begging for a fiscal crisis. An extreme fiscal crisis occurs when a country defaults on its debt. Defaults can take various forms. A country can just refuse to repay debt that is expiring, or it can negotiate a restructuring of the debt by lengthening maturities and bargaining interest rates down. This tends to be a common approach, but creditors won't accept it unless the country agrees to radical budget reforms. Another approach is to inflate the debt away. That's a nightmare for a country's residents. And no democratic developed country has done it since the World War II. But plenty former communist countries and emerging economies have. I worked internationally for a time and witnessed 10,000% inflation up close. It does fix up your business budget, but at enormous cost. The approach to restructuring is much more sensible. Some countries, seeing themselves at the brink of revolt, choose to reform their budget before the default is necessary. If one looks at the history of reforms, they tend to emphasize the spending side of the budget rather than the tax side. When Canada got into trouble in the mid-1990s and they were in big trouble, interest was taking 40% of their revenue. 100% of its adjustment occurred on the spending side of the budget. They did not increase taxes at all. More recently in Ireland, 2/3 of the deficit cuts were on the spending side and 1/3 involved tax increases. I suspect that U.S. reforms would focus more on the tax side because our overall tax burden is now less than the average of the past 50 years. Later, it will go up steadily under current law, but not now. Reform could leave us with a new broad-based tax, such as a VAT or carbon. Regardless of the nature of reforms, the policy change is necessary to get out of the crisis that extremely painful. They will be especially painful to those at the extremes of the ideological spectrum. The left will have to give up social programs that they love dearly and accept the shrinkage in the size of government. The right will have to accept new and higher tax burdens. There will, of course, be much damage internationally because of the international importance of American financial markets. It's not unlimited to expect a worldwide recession. Many will respond that the chances are very low that we shall experience a full-blown crisis in the near or even distant future. But then we are talking about a low probability event, and low probability event is very painful. In a more rational world, this is just the sort of event that you can insure yourself against. The best insurance policy would be to take a series of budget actions that lower the probability of a crisis almost to zero. That's all.
Thank you, Rudy. We're going to turn next to Ken Smetters of the Wharton School. We're going to have a few words on demographic changes, specifically aging. Demographic changes, leave it at that. And the way that interacts with the economy and national debt.
Sure. So I also have 3 points, and thanks for the invitation as well. The first one is about public debt. I'm repeating some remarks that Olivier Blanchard and myself were on a panel with the Fiscal Summit, Peterson, a couple months ago. And of course, he's now appointed president of the AEA. He's made the point that maybe debt is not as costly as it used to be. And the director of the Penn budget model, and we agree. The cost per dollar of debt has gone down in terms of net borrowing costs. In terms of his main point is what's called the marginal product of capital. When government debt absorbs some capital, otherwise would have gone to productive investment, that marginal product has gone down as well, assuming the fixed equity premium, and so therefore the distorting cost per dollar of debt have gone down. And we agree, and we have that into our model. And in fact, we even right now have a slightly negative real borrowing rate in net of inflation for the government on a duration-weighted basis. The problem is that we just have so much debt, and it's just the sheer size of debt is the problem. By 2050, us and CBR are pretty much on the same page, a little bit different, but pretty much on the same page. Both 150% or more of GDP in debt. And in particular, if you were able to stabilize that debt output ratio, something around today, you would have higher GDP by 2050, 2 to 6%, depending on how you did it. It's not true that there is a pure debt effect. You always have to say how you're going to stabilize that debt, whether you're cutting spending, increasing taxes, and the distorting effects. And so in the end, it wasn't much of a debate. We pretty much agreed on the basics there. It reminds me of a debate supposedly a debate I had 15 years ago with Peter Diamond. It turned out to be the most boring debate possible. It's basically agreed on everything related to Social Security. The second issue that's really related to this is still part of part one here, is that people have pointed out there's not a lot of correlation between debt and government borrowing rates. And then people like Robert Barrow and others have made this point. I was discussed on one of Barrow's papers last year, and that is actually a very misleading point. In particular, that really doesn't comment on the economic impact of government debt. In particular, the theory of government debt is supposed to be more government debt actually increases its borrowing costs over time because it's competing for household savings and international capital flows. But if you look empirically, lots of the run-up in government debt over time has been countercyclical. And any reasonable model that reproduces that phenomenon has what's called correlation in the shocks in the economy over time to get a realistic business cycle. And so what happens is that as a negative TFP shock, a negative shock to the economy happens, the demand for safe assets actually goes up by even more than the supply of debt, even though debt is countercyclical. As a result of that, you can actually have interest rates going down, not up, when government debt goes up. But that's not answering the question that we care about when it comes to fiscal policy. That's a cyclical question. When you talk about government policy, we care about the systemic, not the cyclical stuff. And we're asking the question there, given all the cyclical bounces that happen, does adding to the mean path actually matter? And it does matter, even at current interest rates and current marginal product of capital. The second issue is the non-government debt. You know, debt markets are big, $100 trillion worldwide, $40 trillion US. That's bigger than the stock market. A lot of people don't realize that. The government total debt in the United States is bigger. It's about $40 trillion. The total value of the stock market is about $30 trillion. The corporate bond market in particular is about $9-ish trillion. It's over the counter, so you don't see it in the nightly news and things like that. But it's a big market. And the thing that scares me the most in the corporate bond market is actually the role of covenants. Covenants are going away in the corporate bond issuance. And that's scary. Covenants are the one thing that we talk about in my lecture 15 on moral hazard, where you have asymmetric information between borrowers and the company insiders and lenders. There's a principal agent problem that happens between bondholders and equity holders. And equity holders want to borrow a bunch of money and gamble with that money because they get the upside and the bondholders get stuck with the downside. So covenants play a role of controlling for moral hazard by controlling what's called uses of capital. Nowadays, covenants are disappearing in the corporate bond market simply because there's so much capital. So if you're out raising debt and someone says, I want covenants over uses of capital, you're like, I'll just raise it from Joe Schmo down the street and now get weakened covenants. And that is a scary thing. We're talking about so much debt now floating around without covenants because the incentive of equity holders is to gamble with that debt, which is the whole reason why covenants exist. To put that in comparison to the mortgage market, it's a much bigger issue than the mortgage defaults that we initially had that got magnified through CDS and so forth. The third issue is on the issue of trade, and I actually think that trade is really not always well understood in the sense that people often focus on reduced form models that say, okay, what's the impact on GDP today? And we have our own predictions of kind of we're budgeting about 4% GDP reduction from the trade war. It depends on how long the trade war lasts and so forth. There is a flip side to the current account. We call that the capital account. And in particular, for the balance of payments, if you are shutting down trade, you're also, for the most part, shutting down capital flows internationally. And when you shut down capital flows internationally, your borrowing cost goes up. If you remember the whole White House debate, including it's us, because we came out saying the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was going to be more expensive. What they're saying is going to be very far from paying for itself. And they basically were saying, no, we have these really robust international capital flows. We're not going to have higher interest rates and so forth. Well, you're not going to get those robust capital flows if, in fact, you're really leading to a trade